The radar screen flickered in the pre-dawn darkness of Bagram Airfield, and Captain Dmitry Volkov leaned closer, his coffee growing cold in his hand. Something was wrong. The blip shouldn't have been there, crawling across Afghan airspace at barely 200 knots, losing altitude in increments that suggested catastrophic damage rather than tactical descent. The identifier was garbled, the transponder signal weak and intermittent, like a heartbeat struggling against the inevitable. Volkov reached for the radio, his fingers hesitating over the transmit button. 3 hours earlier, Striker 2-1 had been declared lost over the Korangal Valley. No ejection beacon, no mayday, just silence swallowing the mountains and the assumption that follows silence in war. The operations center had already begun the paperwork, the kind that transforms living pilots into statistics and memories. But now this ghost signal, this impossible return, moved across his screen like an accusation against certainty itself. He keyed the mic. Unidentified aircraft, November Whiskey Corridor, authenticate or divert immediately. Static answered him, the white noise of distance and interference. Then, breaking through like gravel scraped across metal, a voice emerged. Bagram Tower, this is Striker 2-1. Aircraft heavily damaged. Single engine operation. Flight controls compromised. Request emergency clearance and medical on standby. The voice was female, steady despite the strain bleeding through each syllable. Volkov felt ice water replace his blood. Major Kestrel Navin. They'd already started writing her memorial citation. He'd seen the commander's face when the clock ran out on her fuel reserves, watched him close the folder with the finality of a coffin lid. Striker 2-1, Bagram Tower, we have you on radar. Say fuel state and nature of emergency. The reply came fragmented, broken by what sounded like alarms screaming in the cockpit. Tower, I'm running on fumes and prayers. Took heavy fire over the valley, lost my wingman. Aircraft is barely responding. Hydraulics are shot. I've got battle damage across the entire airframe. Volkov was already alerting the emergency response teams, but his eyes stayed locked on that struggling blip. The A-10 Thunderbolt was a beast of an aircraft, designed to absorb punishment that would shred any other plane into confetti. But there were limits even to titanium and determination. 2-1, what's your condition? Are you injured? Silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. 4. Tower, I'm functional, my warthog less so. She's hemorrhaging fuel, and I can see daylight through the left wing where there shouldn't be daylight. I'm going to need every inch of your runway, and probably some of the taxiway too. The tower crew was gathering now, drawn by the impossible return, faces pressed against the glass overlooking the dark runway. Volkov watched the blip descend in jerking increments, each drop in altitude a negotiation between physics and willpower. In the operations center across the tarmac, Commander Richard Hale stood frozen, staring at the same radar feed being broadcast to his monitor. His jaw worked silently, chewing on words that wouldn't come. He'd made the call 3 hours ago, declared her lost, started the casualty notification process. Kestrel Navin, the pilot they'd reassigned from a desk job only 6 months prior, the one some of the old guard still whispered about. Not because she couldn't fly, her record was immaculate, but because she'd survived something most pilots only experience in nightmares. The night insertion gone wrong. The helicopter that never made it home. Navin had been special operations support back then, flying rescue missions into places where maps gave up and hope went to die. She'd survived a crash that killed her entire crew, walked out of enemy territory with a shattered leg, and 2 captured pilots who shouldn't have lived. They gave her medals and then grounded her with PTSD protocols, buried her in logistics paperwork where her hands couldn't shake on a stick. But pilots like Navin don't stay buried. She'd fought her way back into the cockpit through evaluation after evaluation, each one a battle against the institutional memory of her breakdown, the night she'd woken the barracks screaming. They'd given her the A-10 assignment as a compromise, close air support, flying low and dirty where her particular brand of controlled aggression could be useful. Her call sign, Revenant, had started as mockery in some circles. The ghost who came back. The pilot who should have stayed dead. Now Hale stared at the screen and wondered if call signs were prophecy. "Get the meat wagon and fire crews positioned," he said quietly. "And somebody wake up the flight surgeon. If she actually lands this thing, she's going to need medical attention whether she admits it or not." Outside on the flight line, Technical Sergeant Marcus Reeves was already marshaling the emergency response vehicles, their lights painting the darkness in rotating shades of urgency. He'd been the crew chief assigned to Navin's aircraft, had personally supervised every pre-flight, every maintenance cycle. The A-10 was his baby as much as hers, and the thought of that beautiful, ugly beast coming home in pieces twisted something in his chest. The radio in his truck crackled with the tower frequency, and he listened as Volkov guided the damaged aircraft through the approach. "Striker 2-1, Bagram Tower, you're cleared for emergency landing, runway 21. Winds light and variable. Fire crews are standing by." The response was immediate but thinner now, fatigue bleeding through the professional brevity. "Tower, copy. Starting final approach. If this goes wrong, tell Reeves his plane fought like hell." Reeves felt his throat tighten. Standard gallows humor, the kind pilots use when they're calculating odds they don't like. The eastern sky was beginning to gray with the approaching dawn when the aircraft finally appeared. Reeves had seen A-10s return from combat before, had patched holes and replaced panels more times than he could count, but nothing prepared him for what materialized out of the darkness. The Warthog came in low and unsteady, nose high in a desperate attempt to maintain lift with compromised control surfaces. Even from a distance, the damage was catastrophic. The left wing looked like something had taken bites out of it, jagged holes visible even in the dim light. The vertical stabilizers were shredded and smoke trailed from somewhere in the engine housing, a dark streamer against the lightning sky. She was flying wounded and everyone watching knew it. Volkov's voice remained steady on the radio, a lifeline of normalcy in an abnormal situation. 2-1, you're looking good. Maintain current approach. Runway is clear and long. You've got room. Tower, I'm not sure good is the word I'd use, but I'll take it. They crossed the runway threshold low and slow, too slow, bleeding airspeed in a way that made every experienced eye wince. The aircraft seemed to hang suspended between flight and falling, that terrible moment where physics makes its final calculations. Then the landing gear touched with a screech that echoed across the airfield. The impact was hard, harder than any controlled landing should be, and immediately the aircraft began to veer left. One of the tires had blown or the strut had collapsed, and suddenly the Warthog was grinding sideways down the runway in a shower of sparks. Fire crews surged forward as the aircraft finally shuddered to a stop, smoke now billowing from multiple sources. The canopy blew off with a small explosive charge, and Kestrel Navin stood up in the cockpit, her flight suit dark with what might have been blood or hydraulic fluid or both. She climbed down with movements that were too careful, too controlled, the kind of precision that speaks to pain being managed through sheer will. When her boots hit the concrete, her left leg nearly buckled, but she caught herself against the fuselage, one hand pressed against the scarred metal of her aircraft like a farewell. Reeves reached her first, his practiced eye cataloging injuries even as he steadied her. Blood matted her hair on one side and her face was pale beneath the grime and sweat. "Ma'am, we need to get you to medical." Navin shook her head slowly, not in refusal but in something like disbelief. "My wingman," she said quietly, "Captain Torres. We got separated in the valley. Last I saw he was still flying but his bird was in bad shape. We need to get search and rescue out there." She wavered on her feet and Reeves tightened his grip on her arm. "Ma'am, they're already scrambling SAR, but right now, you need medical attention." She looked at him then, and Reeves saw something in her eyes that made him understand why they called her Revenant. There was a distance there, a place she'd gone to survive that she hadn't entirely come back from. "I told him I'd get home and send help," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "I told him." The medical team arrived with a stretcher, but Navin refused it, walking to the ambulance on legs that shook with more than fatigue. As they drove away, she turned to look back at her aircraft, still smoking on the runway, and something passed across her face that might have been grief or gratitude or both. Commander Hale met her at the medical facility. his expression unreadable as the flight surgeon began his examination. He waited until the doctor confirmed she had a concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and severe bruising, but nothing immediately life-threatening before he spoke. "Major Navin, your mission brief was reconnaissance and close air support for the ground team in Koringal. What happened out there?" Navin leaned back against the examination table, wincing as the movement pulled at her ribs. Her eyes were steady when they met his, and there was no apology in them. "We found the ground team under heavy fire. Entrenched position, multiple hostiles with technical vehicles, and at least one Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun they'd concealed in a cave entrance. The team was pinned down, taking casualties. We made the call to engage." Hale's jaw tightened. "That gun should have been identified by intelligence beforehand. Someone's getting fired over this." The corner of Navin's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "The team's alive, Commander. That's what matters. Torres and I made multiple gun runs, took out the technical vehicles and suppressed the infantry. But that Zu-23 got lucky, caught Torres on his 3rd pass. I saw his aircraft take hits, watched him fight for control. He managed to pull up, head east toward the valley mouth." She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to her ribs. "I tried to stay with him, but I took fire on my next pass. The Warthog absorbed most of it, but the hydraulics failed, and I lost almost all flight control authority. Torres called that he was heading for the emergency landing zone near Firebase Python. I told him I'd make it back here and send help." Her voice dropped. "I should have stayed with him." Hale studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You got a crippled aircraft home through 50 miles of hostile territory with no hydraulics. That's not abandonment, Major. That's survival, and it's giving Captain Torres his best chance." He straightened, the commander's mask sliding back into place. "Search and rescue is already in the air. They're using your flight path data to narrow the search area. The ground team you were supporting is secure and evacuating casualties. You did your job." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. 3 hours ago I wrote you off, Navin. I was wrong to do it. Welcome home." After he left, Navin sat in the antiseptic silence of the examination room and felt the adrenaline finally begin to drain away, leaving behind the vast exhaustion that lives in the spaces between survival and death. The flight surgeon returned with sutures and antibiotics in gentle hands. Outside the window, the sun was fully up now, painting the Afghan landscape in shades of amber and dust. She could see her A-10 being towed off the runway by a recovery vehicle, trailing fluids and leaving a dark stain on the concrete. Reeves would already be beginning the damage assessment, counting holes and tallying failures, calculating what could be repaired and what would need to be replaced. She knew that aircraft. Knew its quirks and its stubborn refusal to quit, the way the stick would pull slightly left above 8,000 feet, the particular whine the hydraulics made when they were working properly. She'd flown it through sandstorms and moonless nights, had learned to trust its ugly, ungainly competence. Now it looked like scrap metal held together by prayers and titanium bathtub armor, but it had brought her home. In the operations center, the SAR mission was unfolding in real time. 2 HH-60 Pave Hawks were sweeping the valley, following the trajectory Torres should have taken based on his last known heading and fuel state. The ground team at Firebase Python had been alerted and was sending out patrols. Commander Hale stood at the central display, watching the search patterns unfold with the practiced patience of a career officer who has waited for news too many times. Beside him, the intelligence officer was reviewing the mission footage from Navin's aircraft. The gun camera had captured everything, and what it showed made Hale's stomach tight. The ground team had been seconds from being overrun when Navin and Torres arrived. The hostile force was larger than intelligence had suggested, better equipped, and had clearly been planning something more than a simple ambush. The Zu-23 placement suggested they'd been expecting air support, had prepared for it. Someone would need to answer for that intelligence failure, but right now, Hale's focus was on the 2 pilots who had paid the price for that mistake. The radio crackled with the SAR frequency. "Bagram Control, this is Rescue 1-3. We have located wreckage consistent with an A-10 at grid reference 37 Quebec Micate 452. There's a parachute visible approximately 200 meters from the impact site. Moving to investigate. Hale leaned forward, his hands pressed flat against the console. The entire operations center seemed to hold its breath. Seconds crawled past like hours. Then, Bagram Control, Rescue 1-3. We have one survivor, conscious and mobile. Pilot confirms identity as Captain Louis Torres, Striker 2-2. He's got some injuries but is walking and talking. We're securing the LZ now for extraction. A quiet cheer rose from the gathered personnel, quickly suppressed but genuine. Hale allowed himself a moment of relief before keying his mic. Rescue 1-3, good work. Extract the pilot and secure any sensitive materials from the aircraft. Be advised that area is still considered hostile. The acknowledgement came back crisp and professional, and Hale finally let himself breathe. 2 aircraft down, 2 pilots recovered alive. In the calculus of war, that counted as a win even if it didn't feel like one. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the medical facility. Navin deserved to hear the news directly. He found her in a recovery room, showered and in clean fatigues, sitting in a chair by the window despite the flight surgeon's obvious disapproval. Her left leg was wrapped, and there was a neat line of sutures tracing her hairline, but her eyes were alert and focused. "Captain Torres is alive," Hale said without preamble. "SAR just pulled him out of the valley. He's injured but mobile and coherent. He'll be here within the hour." He watched her shoulders drop, tension releasing in a way that made her suddenly look younger and more vulnerable. She nodded once, not trusting her voice, and turned back to the window. Hale stood there for a moment, weighing his words. "For what it's worth, Major, what you did today getting that aircraft home in the condition it was in, that's going to become legend. The maintainers are already calling it a miracle. Reeves counted over 300 individual damage points on the airframe. Both hydraulic systems failed, you lost half your control surfaces, and the right engine was running on fumes and spite. By all accounts, that aircraft should have been unflyable." Navin huffed a quiet laugh, still not looking at him. "The A-10 doesn't know the meaning of should. Neither do I guess." She finally turned to face him, and her expression was carefully neutral. "When can I fly again, Commander?" Hale had expected the question, but not quite so soon. He studied her, seeing past the physical injuries to the pilot beneath. "The flight surgeon will make that determination, but off the record, take some time, Navin. Process what happened. Talk to the chaplain or the psychologist. There's no shame in it." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "With respect, sir, I've done the therapy. I've processed more than most. What I need is to get back in the air." It wasn't defiance in her voice, just quiet certainty. Hale recognized it because he'd heard it in other pilots, the ones who understood that flying wasn't what they did but who they were. The ones who, when grounded, became shadows of themselves. "We'll see," he said, which was neither approval nor denial. "For now, focus on healing, that's an order." After he left, Navin remained at the window, watching the airfield come alive with the day's operations. F-16s taxied for morning patrols. Supply helicopters lifted off for forward bases, the machinery of war turning with or without her. An hour later, the Pave Hawk carrying Torres landed on the medical facility's helipad. Navin watched the medical team rush out, saw her wingman step down from the helicopter under his own power, one arm in a sling, his face a canvas of bruises and cuts. He looked up at the building as if sensing her gaze, and even at this distance she could see him smile. They wouldn't let her go down to meet him yet, something about rest and observation protocols. But Torres was alive, and that knowledge settled something in her chest that had been raw and bleeding since she'd lost sight of him over the valley. She thought about the moment it had happened, the sudden burst of tracers arcing up from the concealed gun position, the way Torres' aircraft had shuddered under the impact. His voice on the radio, strained but controlled. "Striker 2-1, I'm hit. Lost hydraulics and taking fire. Breaking east." She tried to cover him, made another pass on that gun position even as her own aircraft was screaming warnings at her. She'd silenced the alarms with the same ruthless focus that had gotten her through survival training, through combat rescues, through the night her helicopter had burned in the Hindu Kush. The Warthog had shuddered and bucked as the Zu-23 rounds found their mark, but she'd held the trigger down until the gun position was nothing but smoke and rubble. Then she turned east to follow Tors, but her aircraft was dying by degrees. The stick fought her, sluggish and unresponsive. Warning lights cascaded across her instrument panel like a Christmas tree having a seizure. She'd made the calculation in seconds: stay with Tors and maybe crash together, or head for Bagram and send proper help. The second option had better odds for both of them. She'd told him her decision, received his acknowledgement. The last thing she'd heard from him was, "See you back at base, Rev, don't keep me waiting." She hadn't. Barely. Down in the medical bay, Captain Louis Tors was enduring his own examination, his mind elsewhere even as the doctor probed his injuries. 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and various contusions that would hurt like hell tomorrow. But he was alive, and that seemed improbable enough to be worth celebrating. He'd felt the aircraft come apart around him, felt the terrible moment when the stick went dead in his hands, and the A-10 transformed from aircraft to ballistic object. The ejection sequence had been instinct more than decision. Pull the handles, feel the canopy blow, the rocket motor fire, the violent acceleration that compressed his spine and rattled his brain inside his skull. Then the chute had deployed, and he'd swung in blessed silence above the valley floor, watching his Warthog cartwheels across the rocky terrain in a shower of debris and fire. The landing had been rough, the terrain unforgiving, but he'd executed it by the book, hitting and rolling, the parachute dragging him briefly before he could collapse it. Then had come the dangerous part: survival in hostile territory with enemy forces somewhere nearby, and no certain idea if anyone knew where he was. He'd activated his emergency beacon and found cover in a cluster of boulders, his sidearm in hand, counting his ammunition, and trying not to think about how small 9mm rounds seemed when compared to the whole of Afghanistan. The waiting had been the worst part, every sound a potential threat, every shadow a possible enemy. But training took over, the same training that had carried him through years of missions. Stay calm, stay hidden, trust the system. SAR would come. They always came. When he'd heard the helicopters, he'd risked exposing his position with the signal mirror, flashing the standardized pattern toward the sound. The relief when they'd responded had been physical, a weakness in his knees that had nothing to do with his injuries. Now, being poked and prodded by medical staff, Tors found himself thinking about Navin. She'd stayed over that valley long enough to neutralize the threat even after taking damage. He'd seen it on his last glimpse before ejecting, her A-10 making another gun run, smoking and clearly struggling, but still in the fight. That was Revenant for you, the pilot who came back from the dead and apparently couldn't take a hint about staying alive. They'd been wingmen for 3 months now, long enough for Tors to understand that the rumors about her were mostly wrong. She wasn't reckless. She was fearless, which was different. Reckless was flying without thinking. Fearless was thinking everything through and doing it anyway because it needed doing. He respected that, admired it, even though it sometimes scared him. The door opened and Commander Hale stepped in, his expression giving nothing away. "Captain Tors, good to see you in one piece, more or less. You up for a debrief?" Tors straightened despite the pain. "Yes, sir. Though I should mention that most of the interesting parts happened from my perspective at 30,000 feet through binoculars, and then from the ground watching my plane become a modern art installation." Hale's mouth twitched. "Noted. We'll keep it brief. Walk me through what happened from first contact to ejection." Tors organized his thoughts, falling into the familiar rhythm of mission reporting. Facts, observations, decisions, outcomes. He described the ground team's situation, the hostile positions, the coordinated attack runs with Navin. The moment the Zu-23 opened up, the damage assessment, the decision to head for Firebase Python, the catastrophic failure that forced ejection. Hale listened without interruption, his face impassive. When Tors finished, the commander nodded slowly. Major Navin reported essentially the same sequence. "Her gun camera footage corroborates everything. You both made good decisions under terrible circumstances." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. The ground team you were supporting suffered 2 wounded but no fatalities. The team leader specifically requested that I pass along his gratitude. His exact words were that you and Navin saved their asses, though he used more colorful language. Torres felt something loosen in his chest. The mission had cost 2 aircraft and nearly 2 pilots, but the people they'd been sent to protect had survived. In the end, that was the job. "How's Major Navin, sir? I heard she landed her bird." Hale's expression shifted into something almost like respect. "Landed is generous. She crashed in a controlled manner on a runway. The aircraft is probably salvageable, but it'll be a ground-up rebuild. As for the Major, she's recovering. Banged up but already asking when she can fly again." At tracked with everything Torres knew about her. "She pulled me out of a fire up there, sir. Stayed in the fight even after taking damage to make sure that gun position was neutralized. I'm only here because she put her aircraft between me and that AAA." Hale studied him for a moment. "I'll make sure that goes in the official report. For now, focus on healing. We'll handle the aftermath." After the commander left, Torres lay back against the thin medical facility pillows and stared at the ceiling. He was alive. Navin was alive. The mission had succeeded despite everything. But his aircraft was scattered across a valley floor, and hers was so damaged it might never fly again. The A-10 community was small, tight-knit in the way that forms when people share something most others can't understand. Flying the Warthog wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast or sleek or particularly impressive on paper. But it was honest work, close to the ground, where you could see the people you were protecting and the threats you were eliminating. It required a particular mindset, a willingness to fly low and slow where everything could shoot at you, where you traded speed and altitude for accuracy and impact. Navin had that mindset in spades. She flew like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect, and that made her dangerous in the best possible way. He'd heard the stories about her past, the whispered accounts of the rescue mission gone wrong, the crash, the long walk through enemy territory with wounded pilots and a shattered leg. How she kept them alive through force of will and training, brought them to an extraction point, and then collapsed the moment they were safe. How they'd found her afterward, unconscious from blood loss and pain, but with both pilots alive beside her. The medals had come later, along with the psychological evaluation and the grounding. Torres hadn't asked her about it directly. Some stories belonged to the people who lived them, and pushing for details felt like violation. But he understood now, watching her operate, why she'd fought so hard to get back in the cockpit. Flying wasn't escape for her. It was purpose. 3 days passed before they let Navin and Torres see each other properly. The medical staff had been insistent about rest and observation, concerned about concussions and stress reactions. But finally, they relented, and Torres made his way to Navin's room with his arm still in a sling but moving under his own power. She was standing when he entered, staring out the window at the flight line. She turned at the sound of the door, and something in her expression shifted when she saw him, relief and gratitude and the particular camaraderie that comes from surviving something together. "You look terrible," she said, and there was warmth beneath the dry delivery. Torres grinned, nodding her own spectacular collection of bruises. "Right back at you, Major. Though I hear you landed your plane, showing off." She shook her head, moving to sit with careful precision that spoke to her ribs. "That wasn't landing, that was falling with style. Reeves tells me the damage assessment reads like a mechanical engineering horror story. He's not sure whether to be impressed or horrified that the aircraft stayed together." Torres took the other chair, wincing as he sat. "I saw you make that last gun run. You were already hit. You should have broken off." Navin met his eyes, and there was no apology there. "You needed cover." The ground team needed that gun position gone. The math was simple. Simple, Torres thought, if you were someone who calculated acceptable risks in terms of mission success rather than personal survival. But he understood. They'd both been trained the same way, taught that the mission came first and personal safety was a luxury you couldn't always afford. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying, for finishing it." She nodded once, accepting the gratitude without deflecting it. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, 2 pilots recovering from the same bad day, understanding each other in ways that didn't require explanation. Finally, Torres spoke again. "They're calling you a legend, you know. The way you brought that bird home, the maintainers are already telling stories about it. Reeves says it's going to be a case study in airframe tolerance and pilot skill." Navin looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I just flew the plane. The A-10 did the hard work," Torres smiled. "Yeah, well, the A-10 doesn't have hands to work the stick when the hydraulics fail. Give yourself some credit, Rev, you earned it." Before she could respond, Commander Hale entered with a folder under his arm and an expression that suggested official business. Both pilots straightened instinctively, military bearing asserting itself despite their injuries. "Major Navin, Captain Torres. The investigation into your mission is complete. I thought you want to hear the findings directly." He opened the folder, scanning the contents. "The intelligence failure that led to the undisclosed anti-aircraft position has been identified and addressed. The analyst who cleared that mission brief is being retrained. More importantly, the ground team you supported has been safely extracted, all personnel accounted for. They've formally requested commendation for both of you." He looked up from the papers. "Additionally, the gun camera footage and your testimony have provided valuable intelligence on enemy capabilities in that valley. Your mission, despite the cost, is being classified as a significant tactical success." Navin's expression remained neutral, but Torres saw her jaw tighten slightly. Success was good, but they'd both rather have had accurate intelligence and intact aircraft. Hale seemed to read their thoughts. "I know how it feels. You did everything right and it still cost you. That's war. Unfair and arbitrary and expensive. But you saved lives, eliminated threats, and both came home. Don't discount that." He closed the folder. "You're both grounded pending full medical clearance, which I expect will take at least 2 weeks. Use that time, rest, process. The war will still be here when you're ready." After he left, Navin stood and walked back to the window. Torres watched her, recognizing the restlessness that came from being forced to be still when everything in you wanted to move. "2 weeks," she said quietly. "I'll go insane." Torres laughed despite himself. "Probably, but at least you'll go insane with 2 working legs and ribs that don't stab you every time you breathe. Consider it a tactical retreat." She glanced back at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, Major Kestrel Navin smiled. Really smiled, not the tight professional expression she usually wore, but something genuine and unguarded. "Tactical retreat, I like that. Makes it sound intentional." The 2 weeks passed slowly, each day measured in physical therapy sessions, medical evaluations, and the grinding patience required to let the body heal. Navin chafed against the restrictions but complied, understanding that pushing too hard would only extend her grounding. She spent hours at the flight line when the doctors allowed it, watching Reeves and his team work on her aircraft. The A-10 had been moved to a maintenance hangar, where it sat like a wounded soldier receiving field surgery. The damage was extensive, over 300 holes in the airframe, both hydraulic systems destroyed, flight control surfaces shredded, one engine showing internal damage from debris ingestion. But the titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit had held perfectly, and the redundant systems that made the Warthog famous had degraded gracefully, failing in sequence rather than catastrophically. Reeves walked her through the assessment with the reverence of a priest describing a miracle. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a section of wing where a 23 round had punched through just inches from the fuel tank. 6 inches to the right and you would have been flying a fireball. And here," he indicated the landing gear. "The strut that collapsed on landing was already damaged from ground fire. The fact that it held long enough for you to touch down is pure luck." Navin studied the damage, running her hand along the scarred fuselage. The metal was cold beneath her fingers, pitted and torn but fundamentally sound. The aircraft had absorbed punishment meant to kill her and had remained functional enough to get her home. There was something humbling about that, a reminder that she hadn't survived alone. "Can you fix her?" she asked, and heard the way her voice softened on the question. Reeves grinned. "Ma'am, I can fix anything given enough time and parts. This bird will fly again, but it's going to be a while. We're looking at 3 months minimum, probably 4. She's going to need new wings, new hydraulics, engine rebuild, complete avionics check, basically everything except the bathtub and the gun. He patted the aircraft with genuine affection. But she's worth it. This one's proven herself. She's a keeper. Navin nodded slowly, memorizing the aircraft's current state, filing away the visual reminder of what she'd survived. Then she turned away, the visit complete, and walked back toward the medical facility with measured steps that no longer favored her healing leg. Torres found her in the rec room later, reading a technical manual on hydraulic systems with the focused intensity of someone trying to understand exactly what had kept them alive. He dropped into the seat across from her with a grunt. Still researching, she glanced up, trying to understand the failure cascade. The more I know about what went wrong, the better I can compensate if it happens again. You're assuming it'll happen again. Her expression was matter of fact. It's the A-10 tours. Taking damage is part of the job description. Next time I want to be ready. He couldn't argue with that logic. The warthog-attracted enemy fire the way some aircraft attracted admiring glances. It was designed to survive what would kill anything else, which meant people kept shooting at it to test that theory. Fair enough. But maybe take a day off from the survival analysis. The chaplain mentioned there's a movie night tonight. Something about explosions and improbable physics. Figured it might be a good distraction. Navin considered, then closed the manual. Explosions and improbable physics. Sounds like every mission brief I've ever received. I'm in. The movie was terrible in the best way, full of helicopters doing things helicopters couldn't do and physics that would make Newton weep. But it was exactly the kind of mindless entertainment they needed, and Navin found herself laughing at the worst moments, the kind of laughter that releases pressure and makes the world feel slightly less heavy. Torres caught her eye during a particularly absurd sequence and shook his head in mock despair. She grinned back, and for a moment the war felt far away. The medical clearance came exactly 14 days after the mission, delivered by the flight surgeon with a list of restrictions that made Navin's jaw tighten. No hygiene maneuvers for another 2 weeks. No extended missions beyond 4 hours. Mandatory psychological evaluation before full flight status restoration. She'd expected the first 2. The third one hit differently. "Sir," she said carefully, "I've already completed psychological screening. Multiple times, in fact, my records should show." The flight surgeon, a graying major named Patterson, held up a hand. "Major Navin, I'm aware of your history. I'm also aware that you survived a traumatic incident 3 days ago. This isn't about your past. It's about ensuring you're processing your present. 1 session, clean bill of mental health, and you're fully restored to flight status." It wasn't punitive, she realized. Just cautious, and maybe not entirely unwarranted. She'd been so focused on the physical recovery that she hadn't really examined how she felt about the mission.